Hi, everyone. This is the April 29th meeting of SIG Auth. After some technical details, let's kick it off. The first item on the agenda is the website PR for cluster CA rotation. Micah, do you want to talk about this a little bit?
Yep, this has been, I think I have a pretty good, at this point, there's been a lot of feedback on this PR, but I think it's, I'd like a second eye. I think I'm the only one from SIG Auth who's reviewed it. So if anyone else wants to take a look and make sure that we're covering sort of all the bases in terms of things that need to be touched in the correct order, that'd be great.
Awesome.
Yeah, I think that the other reason to bring this up is just that there's not a guide currently on how to rotate the CA for your cluster. So I think that this is a very valuable guide to have, but I want to make sure that it's comprehensive before we put it up there so that people don't have a non-comprehensive guide.
I think David is probably the one of us that has faced these issues in most places.
See, I knew that, but I didn't want to call him out.
Oh,
I've LGTM'd like 6 of your PRs this week, David, so I feel comfortable giving you this.
the 6 that give you the cookie you want anyway, but yeah. Wow, it only took 151 lines. All right. I will put this on the queue to read through. I can also concede that it is fairly difficult. There are going to be questions overall, like do we want to document how you can rotate individual distinct chains of trust? Because not all trust in the cluster is necessarily uniform.
Yeah, I think having those categories and seeing if the current state of it, I would accept progress without being exhaustive as long as it is not misstating things.
Okay. Yeah, it doesn't require downtime. Sorry, I just started skimming it, but yeah, all right, I will review.
Yeah, I've been pushing back on that. I think it doesn't require downtime. So
I know, like in OpenShift, we rotate this every 30 days. So yeah.
Awesome. Thank you, David. So if there's nothing else on that topic, let's move on to the CSR v1 update.
I can't remember if I had this open last time or not, but this is calling out the v1 API differences. These are things that we had talked about when we were adding the multi-signer support and talking about better validation of the status certificates, and then a couple invariants around not being able to deny and then approve, or approve and then deny. With watch-based signers, racing to deny after an approval is dangerous and misleading. So there are a few invariants that this discusses adding. There's been a fair amount of attention on it. I think David took a look, Mike took a look. So yeah, if you are interested in the v1 CSR API, take a look. Otherwise, I'll probably try to wrap up feedback on that this week.
Awesome.
Jordan, when do you want to have feedback by? I haven't had a chance to look at it. I wanted to look to provide feedback.
If you would like to give feedback, I would appreciate getting that this week. If there are things that require back and forth, we can extend it the next week. But if I don't hear any additional issues, I'll probably look to get it merged this week.
All right, sounds good.
All right, Mo.
Cool. So I made the change to, well, I got the initial change already merged for this to be in the new format, and then I started adding sections to sort of comply with the overall desire of the new kept format. So, I mean, I've had some feedback, Mike. I haven't looked at yours from today. I didn't see it yet.
Yeah, no glaring problems. It all looks good, I think.
Yeah, so I mean, if folks are interested, please do look at it. I mean, there's one API change. There's updates on information to try to make it more specifically current to what we have. There's discussion on environment variables. I don't particularly feel strongly, but I would just like to do whatever we think is the right thing and the safe thing.
Calling out in the doc, there's been a lot of stuff in the comments about like what the current behavior is versus what the doc says, but if you want to actually fold some of that into the doc itself, that would be helpful.
No, I have. So the last comment I did last night pulled in all the feedback except Mike.
Okay.
So yeah, so that part is there. I tried to go in. There were some pieces that weren't necessarily super clear. I just tried to add more words and more verboseness to try to hit all the things. Yeah, and I don't think I think it's Andrew Ali had concerns about me dropping the TLS bits, and Micah, you had responded, which was particularly that not being in GA does not imply that you cannot do that in some future time. So that bit is there as well. I think that covers it. There was, I think, Mike, you had mentioned that we could try to do something better to protect against a malicious binary being executed. You don't know what we do?
So I was just thinking that we could brainstorm.
Yeah, I mean, I would like to do something. I don't like the idea that you download basically data and it causes execution on your machine when the data is read, but that's sort of what the API lets you do.
So yeah, I think we just need to brainstorm, like not letting the kubeconfig be world writable is an example. Making sure we exec binaries that are not controlled by other users is an example, or in like world writable, I guess how we traverse to the binaries, not controlled by unprivileged users. There's a lot of validation that we could do before we exec a binary that we don't do today. It's kind of like SSH refusing to use a private key that is not ACLed correctly. So I think hypothetically there are a number of things. We could brainstorm them. I'm not sure. I guess the benefit of doing that before GA is we could enforce something that is potentially a breaking change.
Do you feel like such a change would be compatible with a beta guarantee?
So I don't know what all the changes are, but after we brainstorm, we could decide which ones are worth it, or if there are options that wouldn't break anybody, which seems unlikely because we are trying to restrict behavior. It is unlikely that it couldn't possibly break anybody, but it is likely that it won't break anybody. Those are ones that we should probably consider. But yeah, I think we need to brainstorm a little bit before we move forward. It's also just like it's kind of a it was just a note. It wasn't actually like something that needs to change. It wasn't a recommendation to change the get.
Okay. Cool. Thank you. That's all I got for that. Does anyone have any comments, feedback, or otherwise?
What release do you want to get all this stuff in?
So certainly I want agreement on the GA requirements for in sort of like the 119 timeframe. If I have time to do all the work, I would like to at least make progress on it in 119. I have set myself up for failure by adding a lot of stuff into the GA requirements around testing and validation, but it's fine. I didn't feel like I put anything in there that we shouldn't have for GA. So, yeah.
Yeah, it seems reasonable and close to something that we should just LGTM at this point. But if anybody else wants to take a pass, please do so soon.
I had one pending comment and just maybe a quick question that can be answered here. About conformance. If it's GA, does it need to be in conformance then? And conformance, couldn't that just be like a static token that you pass back and forth but goes to the webhook?
Yeah, I had that as an open question. I don't think there's requirements for something that is like V1 GA to be in conformance. I don't know really how that applies to the kubeconfig format.
Right.
Yeah. Go ahead, David.
Sorry. GA does not mean conformance, right? RBAC is GA, but it is not a conformance requirement. As a for instance, we have other examples as well.
Yeah, and I think that's very fair. I just didn't know how we felt about like a subset of like the kubeconfig, not like somehow being part of conformance.
And what does it mean for kube control, I guess? Does it mean that nobody is allowed to call something kube control unless they have implemented support for this? Is forking kube control a common practice, or are people using the binaries that we release?
These are all not kube control, but also other clients in other languages that consume the kubeconfig format.
Sure.
Yeah, I guess I just don't really understand like what the meaning of conformance is for that, and like what necessarily is like the benefit. Like certainly like if you have some tool that reads your kubeconfig and then like performs actions on your behalf, you want it to be able to read the exec section if that's how you authenticate to the cluster. But that sort of requires that like the tool is like running like locally or something, right? Like you couldn't, for example, give a kubeconfig to some web app and then expect it to exec that section and do something.
Yeah, I mean, certainly workload portability was the primary goal of conformance originally. There's certainly an element of if we projected kubeconfigs into pods, that would be different. I mean, it's definitely a part of the ecosystem. It definitely deserves a test. It hasn't traditionally met the bar of what we would have called conformance. Doesn't mean that conformance couldn't expand, but I would take it to the conformance working group and ask.
So I think to answer the question, GA does not mean covered in conformance, and we can consider that separately from the GA of the feature.
Yeah, conformance is not required for GA. Having conformance tests for new APIs for GA is required. But conformance is not required to accept those tests into conformance for GA. In the subtle case of where we might decide that that might not be acceptable for all conformant distributions.
I don't think I parsed that last statement.
You required to prepare tests that could be suitable for conformance. The conformance group could decide not to mark that as conformance because that's unacceptable for conformant distributions, right? Like if if it requires something that
I see. So basically test coverage is required and
suitability for inclusion into conformance is required, but not entrance into conformance required for you to be GA. Although there's a certain thing of like, if the API is such that it would be intended to be the kind of thing that's conformance and we decided not to include it, that would be probably a misstep. Like we missed something in the CAP process.
yeah.
Like the examples are like pod security policy. Had that gone to GA, that would have been one where a conformant distribution was not required to turn it on necessarily. And we may not have agreed to change the definition of conformance to require that you use out of the box pod security policy, but the behavior of the API should have been covered by conformance. So there's just a ton of nuance in it. Like, I think it would just be, it's probably good enough to say good test coverage that works and tests the API is what SIGs should care about so far.
Yeah, if we accepted kubeconfig files in APIs, then this might be a bigger sticking point.
We do. All of our webhooks do.
They do not in the REST APIs. You cannot provide a kubeconfig file via the REST API.
No, I mean, sure, but you can provide it to the API server and you expect it to work.
A conformant Kube API server is not required to accept all the flags that Kube API server accepts.
Yeah, conformance is currently oriented at the REST API service.
Okay.
So you can swap out implementations. You can do almost anything on the back end as long as the front end appears and passes the conformance tests.
I mean, that seems like a reasonable bar, right? If you can't tell the difference, then it's the same, right? This is our duck typing for Q.
Yeah. That is the difference. We'll see if it's reasonable.
Okay. Mike, I think you said you had 2 questions. Did we cover both questions?
I think there was just the one. Yeah, just the one.
All right. Anyone else before we move on to the next topic? I don't know where Mike went.
Can you still see me and hear me?
Oh, sorry. You moved on my screen. I was like, where did you go?
All right, let's move on then. So, Mo, you have the floor. Cool.
Okay, so I have not looked at any feedback provided today. So if you provided feedback today, sorry, I haven't seen it yet. But yeah, so I opened this, I don't know, like 2 weeks ago, something like that. It's been a little bit. I've gotten, it was 2 weeks ago. I've gotten pretty decent feedback from community members, relatively positive. I haven't gotten anything from leads, so certainly need that. Do you want me to walk through the API? I don't know who's actually had a chance to look at this, so I can certainly walk through the API if you want to show it. Do you want to switch to the pretty view? So it's like all the whatever's the.
All right.
Yeah. So this is.
Okay, here we go.
Yeah, net new API in the authentication.k8s.io API group. I think we called the type declaration bit a union, like a union discriminator. I'm trying to remember exactly what it is, but general idea is you can specify some kind of dynamic authentication config, and based on the type, one of the other 3 fields, or sorry, the other 3 fields gets to be invoked. So for CA bundles, it's just the CA bundle. For OIDC, it is similar to what you can specify on the CLI, except it uses the format for how client configs are done for webhooks and admission. I don't know if you would just redefine the type here, but I didn't want to get too much into that. My desire there is, we have the distinction between service URLs for webhooks for admission, and I think I would like to have the same here, so that way, if we improve on how we handle things for services, maybe around TLS, we get that for free. there's I didn't bother going into the webhook one yet, mostly because I'm kind of hoping we get a better story around API server authentication to webhooks, but it's fine. That's the general high level. There's been discussions that I haven't made any changes to the API since the discussions have started, just because I wanted to let people have a chance to look at it. I think the primary one that I would want to change is I did not include any language around protection of the API. And I think I would definitely want, similar to the RBAC cluster role aggregation check, I would want a hard check to make sure that you are cluster admin and not just somebody who can access this API. Let's see, what else is there? I think that's the top one that comes to mind. Yeah, do folks have questions, concerns? I'm sure there are. Would like to address those.
Yeah, I was started to reply to this morning, but did not get a chance to hit send. I guess my primary, like what I want to dig into is to like figure out exactly why the authentication proxy approach is not compatible with this, just so that we do have like an understanding of why that mechanism isn't working for people, because that has been the recommendation that we've made for like these types of extensions to people in the SIG in the past. So like theoretically, every year the Kubernetes CRDs and the front proxy, I think it would behave and handle a little bit differently, but nothing here is incompatible with a CRD-based approach. And I think working out usability problems or development problems with the front proxy approach would just be beneficial in the long run. From a like, does that make sense?
Yeah, I mean, I responded to your comment for why I don't believe the approach is like valid. It comes down to a variety of things, seamlessness. There's certainly protections you can't do on CRDs that you can do for native types. Right, because a person can just remove any webhook that you have, like an admission webhook that's trying to protect the CRD from any like malicious behavior, right? This is a cluster admin API. There's no other way to look at it, right? And like to a certain degree, right? Like the proxy approach, you know, you could say that you could do that for RBAC, you could do that for admission, right? But it pushes the burden too hard on the other end, right? Like you have to basically make this perfect proxy that has like an enormous security surface, and you get to own the whole thing for some reason. Like I don't really see this meaningfully different than like admission webhooks, right? They can cause particularly dangerous and strange things to happen on your cluster that weren't necessarily intended. And since we are okay with an impersonation proxy, and I think that's what you're asking about, right? Like you are saying an impersonation proxy and not some other kind of proxy.
Either, I think, right now. We can talk about impersonation proxy if that makes sense. I think it does make sense because it's the one that's available to deploy basically anywhere that Kubernetes is running.
Right, and that's kind of what I'm saying, right? If you can sort of hack it with an impersonation proxy, why can't we just build it into core and like actually streamline and support it, right? Like with the OIDC bit and the X509 bit, you don't need to run anything technically, right? If your OIDC server is like GitLab, you don't have to run anything at all, right? You can just use GitLab. If you just want some bundles to be supported, you don't have to run anything at all. And the verification never leaves the API server, right? So like there's actually like significantly different like network architectures at play, and like I get to trust things less. Like I trust the things I trust, which is the API server, the identity private provider, whatever you want to trust, right? like certainly, obviously, in many cases, you're going to want your webhook, and probably will run the webhook on the API server somewhere.
One of the comments. Sorry, go ahead, Mike.
I was just going to say that the usability issue could be argument could be made about like Gatekeeper, basically any other feature that we choose to build outside of core.
But Gatekeeper integrates with a well-supported REST API, right? That's what I'm trying to get to, right? I'm not saying let's build like webhooks, like, I don't know, like let's not build like RBAC v2 or like let's not build like OAuth directly into the API server, nothing like that. I'm saying guarantee a seamless integration of auth in any environment, right? Like if I want to have an opinionated auth stack that I use across providers, I can't really do that today, right? I don't want to use an impersonation proxy. I don't want to tell people, hey, if you're a user, this is the URL you go to, and if you're like not a user, you go over here, right? Like I don't want to give a second-class experience just because my thing doesn't have a well-supported REST API extension point. Especially since
CJ.
Yes.
Yeah, I was. One of the comments was about, why would you give, since this thing would be cluster admin permission only, why would you give users cluster admin? I just wanted to call out that like GKE, for example, does make a distinction between sort of operators and admins, where today we don't have this available to our customers, even if they are cluster admin for all other things. And I don't know if it's a distinction without meaning, but this would be the first time that we would open up a config that happens before authorization, which scares me a little bit. I don't know if it's reasonable.
CJ, does GKE run like an authorization webhook? Like on
we run our own authorization webhook.
Right.
For
so why would you not? If you did not want to support GKE, which I'm perfectly fine. You would just reject any attempts from anyone to communicate with India.
Yeah, and I think Micah called that out as well. That we would. So there's a couple ways to do that. We either build it into the API and say, provide a way, sort of not through RBAC, to limit how this API can be used. So you could say, I don't know, ordering or restrictions where a cluster operator might be able to say, no, I'm not going to let you throw in random authentication webhooks at me, but maybe I'll let you, I don't know, do some limited OIDC stuff.
Yeah, and I definitely want to support, like the conversation I would want a GKE customer to have with you guys is, hey, I want to use this feature. Are you willing to let me use it? Not, hey, can you go do this work for me, right? Like it's, like I would, if this thing GAs at some point, right, I would want it to on by default, but I want all the knobs that make operators comfortable. And if they decide they're not, then fine, you turn it off, and then you can have a conversation with your end customer saying, hey, this is why we can't support you doing whatever you're trying to do, right? But I don't want to be, yeah, we can't support you, but you can run like this hacky proxy that is running as cluster admin, and you take all this risk, right? Like, I think the conversation.
Yeah, we've definitely had this conversation because we get this request, and a lot of times people say, can you just open up the authentication CLI flags to us? And we're like, whoa. But I think Mike's point is that is the thing that people want, and is the thing that we want as maintainers of this, a like fully featured RESTful API. It might be, I don't know, but what they really want is just, I want my Kubernetes to work with my authentication stack. And there's just a question of, is it the right thing for us to make that a dynamic API and figure out all the ways that can be used and abused? Or do we push off to existing things? And yeah.
I wanted to raise the point that I think we just keep coming back around to the issue that we've never addressed what the surface area of Kubernetes is when you cross the boundary between workloads to infrastructure. It's just not a crisp line, and that's fine. The reality is plenty of people get huge amounts of value from Kubernetes without that line being there. But like this argument is just, we don't have a principle that guides how we configure admission webhooks, how we configure auth webhooks, how we configure dynamic audit sessions. We don't have a way to segregate infrastructure running on the cluster. We don't have a way to restrict who can you gate or logically separate out the powers of cluster admin. I'm not advocating necessarily that we have to go do that, but it does kind of come back to, most of these issues come down to anything infrastructure related. There's no guiding principle. We have a guiding principle for every workload API, even if it sometimes isn't a great one. Like, use a namespace. Service accounts are tied to a namespace. Secrets are tied to a namespace. The kubelet will restrict these things. Could we, everybody's gonna have different needs too. Like Mo and I probably want to go do things with self-hosting and running clusters and allowing configurability that a GKE or an EKS or an on-premise provider might not offer. If we could come up with a way to have those principles, would that make us happier? Or is it just too much work to go have those principles, and so we'll spend the time arguing on this stuff without a clear guiding direction?
Yeah, I mean, I guess I would ask, how is this sort of meaningfully different from admission webhooks, for sure, but even to a certain degree with RBAC, right? Like you can create an RBAC rule that lets system::authenticated do anything, right? And now authn is basically no longer functioning because authn is just saying, you're nobody, you're system anonymous, and you can do anything, right? I guess I'd be very curious to know, what are we trying to defend against? Right, certainly, I would understand, so I remember, in OpenShift dedicated, right? We don't want SLA violations, right? We want to be able to support our customers and give them some guardrails so they don't destroy everything. But that is hard if you give them cluster admin minus some arbitrary things that you're trying to enforce with a CLI-based webhook or something. Am I understanding that correctly, CJ? In between.
Sorry, I keep giving you an echo as soon as I unmute, don't I?
So let me mute myself.
Now I can see it on I'm using the Zoom web app for the first time, and it's not going great. To try to make it concrete, let's say I am a GKE user at some large company, and I'm telling all these smaller teams to go do stuff in their GKE clusters, and I'm in charge of maintaining the security policy on all those GKE clusters. I, as a GKE customer in charge of maintaining security policy, would be scared if users could randomly start authenticating using their Instagram accounts. And so I want GKE to give me a way to prevent that from happening. Now, all that is doable, and we could figure it out. It's just right now it's easy because it's just not configurable.
But I would ask, how is that so the person you're defending against, at least on those clusters, has to have cluster admin, right? That's sort of what we were asking about. How is that different from that person setting up an impersonation proxy on those clusters with cluster admin rights, and then just telling people, hey, yeah, you can use this thing I set up, and you can log in with Instagram, and it works.
At least with the impersonation proxy, it passes through audit, so you at least have a little bit of room to defend it. The front proxy, I'm not sure what that shows. By
passing through audit, you're saying that it records it, right? You want to know definitely in audit logs that someone was doing bad things. Okay. So I mean, I actually called that out in the design because I knew that was an actual important thing from some of the conversations I had with Jordan. So certainly, I very firmly believe that we should include as much metadata about how you authenticated into the audit stream. And that's not just necessarily true for this API, right? I think we've been very hesitant in the past to put things into user info because it gets part of authorization, and admission can start doing things with it. But I don't think we need to be so cautious with audit annotations, right? Being able to say, yeah, this person authenticated OIDC, and heck, maybe here's the issuer URL, and here's when their stuff expires, those types of things. It's just metadata. I don't particularly find it to be secret, but I think from an auditor perspective, I would like to know that, before we removed basic auth, right? If you were using basic auth to authenticate the clusters, like I probably want to know and be like, hey, please stop. Like we've gotten past this.
Yeah, I want to reiterate, I don't have a hard, this just makes me anxious. It's not that I don't want it to happen. It just kind of like corners of it scare me in the same way that the fact that I can create a CSR for a client cert and all of a sudden I'm Joe in system masters.
Or the way that you can ingress controller and it has access to all secrets and it can become every controller manager in the system until we get that gap closed. I mean, and that's what I mean by principles is like, we're at the limits of what, like every one of us is trying to improve in some dimension the operational usability of Cube for features that involve things that aren't clearly workload APIs. Like every API we've discussed here is an administrative or an infrastructure API, not a workload API. And we don't really have like a hard set of rules or guidelines to say what our roadmap is for that stuff. Like we all want things, but we don't have like a clear, we agree to do these things in this way from these principles, and each CAP can base off of those. I don't know, because like, I mean, I'd love to see subdivision of namespaces and like better isolation within a set of core. And like, that's a really complex design that without a set of principles, there's no point to even trying to go further on that. Like being able to hide a namespace from the set of namespaces that cluster admins can edit. Without a set of principles, there's no point to even doing that design, because then we just get into like this kind of discussion of like, well, does this make sense for a workload? Does this make sense for, you know, who can be hidden from? Can they use an API to access it? Are there APIs that are controlled by RBAC? Are there APIs controlled by special RBAC?
So Clayton, I guess what I would ask for you on that is, what are you guys using in OpenShift, right? You've basically shoved everything into the Cube API via CRDs, right? So like, how are you guys trying to distinguish?
And we program flags and we just call it a day. We deploy controllers as pods, and you know, at some point, like too, some of this is if you're running as a service, you can have a hard boundary, and everybody gets to define what the hard boundary they're comfortable with. And if you're not running as a service, you're going to have to give up some of that. I think I'd like us to see having better hard boundaries between applications on a cluster. And I think that overlaps a little bit with what we're talking about, but we would all need to agree on what those are, what those boundaries are, and how they should be discussed.
So I think for the X509 Authenticator, I think there is, speaking of specifics here, the X509 Authenticator makes anybody, infrastructure providers, or just end users, it makes deploying a front proxy challenging, more challenging than it was. Potentially it's already pretty challenging, because now we have to plumb any new client CA bundles up the serving stack, which is maybe non-trivial. I think for the webhook mode, I'm particularly concerned with funneling like secret material back at some user controlled endpoint. For like GKE, we use first party credentials to talk to Kubernetes API servers, and that the model there is that you have like cloud platform scope to access token and talk to a Kubernetes API server. We would need to be very sure that those aren't being forwarded down into a cluster when, for example, like a webhook, we get a webhook error on our static webhook authenticator config. There is, like back to your point about having a conversation with your infrastructure, customers having a conversation with their infrastructure providers. I do think that there is a model here that we can potentially get to where that conversation doesn't even need to occur because infrastructures cannot stop you from deploying a front proxy. I do think it's worth pursuing because it is the like one way that authentication extension can be achieved that can be basically deployed anywhere right now, and it has been what we've been pushing people towards. If we do, we know that some people are.
Is that we don't have an ecosystem, right? If that was actually a good solution, people would actually rally and try to build stuff around it. And I'm not going to talk because Tim has a hand. Please, Tim.
Yeah. I mean, we do have a number of examples of authentication proxies. There's GKE or Kubernetes OIDC proxy. There's a JetStack one. There was one presented in the SIG Auth meeting. We recommended, I think, Gravitational has one for certificates. So there is an ecosystem, and it is what, like, when people have asked about like this type of extension in the past, it is what we've recommended for them to do. And I think it can be made, improved, like the developer experience. And I think it's probably worth it just because it has all the benefits of this proposal. And we need to work to limit, I guess not all. I think it is possible to have get pretty close to the same user experience if we can work through some of the usability issues of deploying it like such an authentication proxy. Anyways, I have not like fully formulated thoughts, as I mentioned at the beginning of this. I'm going to try to write down something more coherent today and comment on the PR.
Tim, you want to go? I think we're really out of time for this topic, and we still have big topics.
Good. Right. Tim.
We can't hear you, Tim.
Can you hear me now?
Yeah.
Okay, sorry. You probably didn't hear my earlier comment either. I'll leave my comments about the authentication proposal on the PR so we can get to audit. Yeah, so we were going to pick up the conversation from last week. We wrote up 2 one-pagers kind of elaborating on the proposals that we discussed last week. Not sure how we want to go about discussing these here. Would it be helpful to run through the proposals right now or just pick up the conversation where we left off?
Yeah, I mean, we are kind of short on time, so maybe if we pick we think are the sticker pieces, it might be better. People feel comfortable with that.
Yeah, sure. Take it away.
At least from my perspective, I mean, the big one's just getting this configured on existing clusters. I know we've talked about there's other ways of doing that. Through like maybe a config file that reloads without the API server restarting. Yeah, in the other proposal where we're dropping in, you know, an extra piece of machinery, you do have to turn on all the events in that case, and you're always sending out all the events to that piece, which it seems like that's going to be a hard sell for the provisioners. I just know in going around trying to get dynamic, you know, the alpha stuff configured for people in the provisioners, it was pretty hard to just get them to turn a flag on. A couple flags was pretty challenging. So I think, you know, adding a whole other thing and then always sending all the events out over to that just seems like it's gonna be a really hard sell. And I'm afraid without that sell, you're not gonna have any adoption really, and then the features just kind of would be stuck in a place of, you know, not having enough adoption to move forward. So that'd be my primary concern with it.
So what can you like high level, what are the like main architectural decisions between two models?
Yeah, sorry, maybe we should have gone over that, just not on the time. So the two we're proposing right now is one is where you would deploy totally out of tree kind of CRD pod, and you'd have a webhook that sends all the events to that pod, and that pod could be running, you know, any given namespace, but then the policy would be applied from that pod out to whatever audit sinks you have on the other side. The other version, you would have a static policy kind of sit on the node, and then you could have dynamic syncs, and they would just be emitting whatever events are set in that static policy. And I guess the idea here is we got kind of hung up on the policy stuff, and having a static policy also solves some of the performance issues we ran into. Does that make sense?
Just to clarify, in the other proposal, you also have a static policy that's applied before the events are sent to the proxy. I think the main.
Oh, I thought we weren't doing that. Okay, I got you.
Yeah. So I think the only difference really between these two proposals is whether that dynamic audit proxy is a separate process or a separate pod, or if that is running in the API server process.
Okay.
And whether the dynamic audit webhook configurations is a kind of CRD or first party API.
Yeah. I guess there's one usability difference. How do people actually want to consume audit events? Do they want like a log stream, or is kind of the webhook model preferred?
It just kind of depends on the application. Like different customers want different things, particularly for like kind of the use cases we had were like drop-in third-party tooling. So say you just have a cluster running, you could drop in tooling that consumes audit events and provides like security services to, you know, who did what when, looking for anomalies, and can also store that data. But sort of drop-in plugins was kind of our main use case. I know Chris couldn't join today, but I know, you know, she's running Falco. Similar thing where they're looking, you know, want to take the audit logs and write rules against the audit logs for any, you know, potentially malicious activity going on in there. So to have something like that, you'd basically need to have a cluster that was already kind of configured in a manner that was putting all of these logs to a separate pod all the time. And I just feel like that might be a hard sell to the provisioners, just kind of based on what I've already gone through trying to get it enabled. Unless we see a way to kind of make that easier.
I'm a little concerned. This kind of gets back to Clayton's earlier point, actually, about like how are we defining the boundaries of the infrastructure here.
Yeah.
I'm a little worried that this sounds kind of like the cluster provisioners aren't turning on the feature we want, so let's make it a mandatory core feature. To force it to be turned on.
I don't mean mandatory at all. I just mean it's really hard to even get them to turn on a flag, right? More or less to have the conversation that you're going to be sending all of your audit events to a separate pod somewhere all the time just to enable, you know, sort of dynamic syncs out of it. I even floated the idea kind of internally to, you know, people that we would have a high amount of influence over within VMware, and they just said that wouldn't work for them. They wouldn't turn something like that on. I mean, granted, that was one person I talked to, but it seems like a pretty hard sell. If we want it to be adopted, I just don't know that a lot of people are going to be willing to do that based on what I've seen at least.
Yeah, I think for speaking for GKE, it would be beneficial to some ability to do pre-processing on the raw stream before we hand it off to customer configured audit syncs. I guess, like, for example, pushing through, we have like a DLP, or I think it stands for data loss prevention pipeline that looks for employee names, like maybe an SRE that was like debugging, or somebody that, a support person that used Dev Console to look at the API or look at the API server. We want to make sure that privacy of employees is maintained when these audit events reaches customer, and we can we replace those with some like Google or at google.com or something, and also to make sure that we are not leaking and remain security material. So some way to funnel this through some pre-processing step would be useful for us to be able to turn it on and get past our privacy review.
Jim has his hand up.
Yes, so I wanted to bring up a discussion that we had earlier in the policy working group related to these proposals. So I think the question was, are either of these looking at also allowing to configure different audit event sources other than the API server? The example there would be policy engines which want to report on compliance of policy rules, things like that.
I think they are not currently, but it is an interesting idea.
Yeah, I hadn't thought of that.
Okay. So with 1 minute left, what's the question here? I was not aware of these docs. I will take a read and try to get some opinions. What do you want from Patrick and Tim?
Sorry, you're breaking up a little bit. I couldn't quite.
What is the call to action? For the
or
SIG?
what's the next steps?
Yeah.
I kind of think we need to put this at the front of the agenda for next week's or 2 weeks from now meeting, because we didn't really have time today.
Yeah.
I think in the interim, let's continue the discussion in the comments and try to come prepared for more discussion next meeting. In any case, none of these changes are going to make it into 119. So this is we have time to kind of figure this out. But I would like to get a conclusion or a decision on kind of what the path forward is for dynamic audit this cycle, so that we can maybe start making some of those changes.
Can we take maybe by enhancements freeze for 119, we have some kind of plan? Certainly by code freeze, but something like that.
Awesome. Thanks for the presentation, Tim and Patrick, and putting together that documentation. I'm ending the recording now. Thank you all for attending.